Hello, I'm Dave Tosch, Executive Director, Wenatchee Valley Senior Activity Center. And today I have Thomas Sandoval here with me. And Thomas is an interesting story. He's a great guy, for one thing, and we've become friends over the years. I've been here a little over 7 years, and I think I met Thomas soon after I arrived. And we got to talking one day, and I learned a lot about Thomas and what he's done in our community. He is I would say, a leader in the Latino community still to this day. He's done a lot for their community and his community, the Latinos, over a long period of time. And I think that, he knows how to collaborate and he knows how to get along. And I think he's been a huge influence, positive influence in our community. I know that he has been involved in multiple organizations. He gets his arm twisted quite often, maybe not so much now. He has been retired for quite a few years from the the state government. And I'm going to have him talk just a little bit about his experiences here in the Valley, what he's done. And I know that he doesn't like bragging about himself, but I'm going to ask him to just say a few words about some of the roles that you've played, some of the positions you've had. And, I know quite a few of them, but I know there's many more. I know that you were a leader in the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce for a good many years. And so I think I've said enough. I'm going to turn it over to Thomas and have him just talk a little bit about his involvement in our community.
Okay. Well, Dave, to start off with, I grew up in Washington State. I'll do my apology up front. I was born in Wyoming, and my folks moved to Washington State when I was 6 months old. So even though I was not born in this state, I was raised in this state and spent my whole life in our state. I grew up in Pasco, Washington, which is down the road from here. Gosh, 80, 100 miles away, that kind of thing. When I grew up back in the 50s and 60s, times were different and our communities were different. And in the town I grew up in Pasco, they were literally segregated sections. Almost what you think of when you think of the Deep South and somebody says we have whites only and blacks only kind of signs, and where you could drink and water and what restaurants you can go in. That was how life was in Pasco when I grew up. Oddly enough, I went to a parochial school. My brothers and sisters and I were the only persons of color in our school. Went all the way through the 9th grade, and that's when our school ended, and we moved on to the high school. And I learned at that time that I couldn't go further in my education because it wasn't permitted back in those good old days. And oddly enough, in our state, they passed nationally bills in 64 and 65, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And I went to high school in 1965, a year that the Voting Rights Act was passed. And my high school years, 66 through 68, 65 through 68, I was in school, and we were just beginning as a community and as a school to adjust to those changes. So the first year that Washington State had actually put some dollars aside through the state legislature to allow them to recruit minorities to go to college for the first time in the history of our state. And Washington State University started in 1861. It was reset up in 1890 when Washington became a state in 1889. And the first year of minority recruitment was in 1968, 70, 80 years after we became a state. In that first year of recruitment, I was the person, along with 35 other Latinos, that were recruited to go to school at the U. 200 black students and 8 American Indians. Of the 35 Latinos that went, 5 of them were women, and my wife, who was not my wife then, was one of those 5 women that were that were able to convince their parents to allow them to go to school. So I met her at school. We eventually married, and that became part of that history, and I've been married since then. So we're just going to celebrate our 50th year in retirement.
Congratulations.
In marriage. Well, you can either say I've swept her off her feet, or she's trying to continue to change me for the last 50 years, and she's working well at it. But outside of that, I grew up in the state, and as I said, I went to the west side to go to school at the University of Washington. I graduated from Evergreen State College a number of years later. But I ended up getting a job in Seattle in a nonprofit organization, community-based agency. And my boss got, believe it or not, misused federal funds and got arrested and went to jail. And so they literally picked from the staff and said, somebody has to run this program. So at 22, I became the director of this $1 million organization and 18 staff, and kind of got thrusted into that moment and went through that process for a number of years. Ran the program well. I hope. We didn't lose any money. Everything worked out okay. And like every program, you burn out. And I had a chance to look for new work, and I went back home to Pasco, where I grew up at. And oddly enough, I found a job at the employment office. And I said, yeah, I can take this temporary job until I find something better. Well, that temporary job went permanent. And after a while, I got a promotion and moved to Olympia and spent 27 years in Olympia, all working for state government for the same state agency. And I completed that work eventually after 30 years and retired. But part of those years, I had a chance to come to Wenatchee, and I was the supervisor of a unit that did reviews of everyone. And in that time, in doing those reviews, I had a chance to come to Wenatchee in the north central area, go up to Okanagan and go to Moses Lake and Ephrata and those kind of places. Loved the area. Just didn't have a chance to get here. There was an opportunity for employment here as a manager of the employment office. And darned if I didn't get a chance to interview. And I'm not sure how they got convinced, but they selected me and I got hired. So I did a number of years here as the manager of the office with 34 staff and $1 million budgets and all that stuff, and did all that until I retired. And I've now been retired, believe it or not, 15 years. So I guess the gray hair is beginning to show. And I did all that wonderful stuff. But during those course of the times, I did a lot of things as a volunteer, even though I worked in state government. And then I did a number of things in my role as a staff person within employment security. One of the volunteer pieces that I did was what you mentioned earlier. I was part of a group called the North Central Washington, not the North Central Washington, the Washington State Association of Hispanic Chamber of Commerces. And oddly enough, the person that was leading that charge wanted to have this young kid come along and take notes and help out. And the hardest part was to keep my mouth shut while they were doing all this, but I did. And I learned a lot from these folks. And at one point, I actually became the state director of the association. And there were 8 Chamber of Commerce's, Hispanic Chamber of Commerce's in Washington State. One of them was here in Wenatchee. And when I moved here to Wenatchee, I was no longer then the director of the chamber, so I joined the local chamber and became the vice president of that and continued to work through a number of things here. Being the manager in the employment office, I met with the city council, county commissioners, elected officials, everybody under the sun. So I was constantly doing interviews and evaluations and talking to the press and doing all those fun things. So you get used to doing some of those things. One of the things Latinos did not have is enough role models in our state and in our community here. So one of the things you get used to doing is bringing people along. And so I was very good at doing some of that, and that was helpful.
Yeah. Well, I witnessed some of that. I guess the thing I saw the most of that you were involved with was the chamber, Hispanic chamber. And I remember you had several banquets here at the senior center, and you filled the place up.
Yes.
And I think that attests a lot to your efforts of bringing people together. And I know there was a lot of business owners that supported it. I know somebody had to go behind the scenes to work a lot of those details out. I was just very impressed with the organization. And I think that was one of the times where we talked about having the Hispanic Chamber meet here at the Senior Center. And we were able to make that work out over several years. And so I always enjoy trying to help other nonprofits and small organizations that don't have a place to meet. We try to open up our doors here to allow that to happen. And I know that there's been several other things. I've just always been impressed, though, with your long list of folks that you can call up, and you don't even have to twist their arm necessarily. And I know you've already mentioned it a little bit, but maybe just tell us a little bit about some of those other organizations that you've been involved in. I know there's several, and you probably would say, well, there's too many to talk about, but I know that you could pick a few.
Well, thinking back, of some of the things I've done. There at the University of Washington, when I was a student, there was a number of us minority students that were in one dormitory, and it was called Lander Hall. And because a number of Black and Latino students were living in that dorm, the folks locally called it the ghetto. And so you go like, okay. Well, one of the odd things that came up is they asked me if I would run for the presidency of that dorm. And at 18, 19 years old, I didn't know what to say. So I told folks, I said, well, I'm not running to be the president of the dorm. And they said, well, what are you doing? I said, I want to be the dictator. And they said, well, you can't do that. This is America. And we went through this huge argument. And I said, I'm just trying to, be in this dorm. So I said, I didn't know what else to say. So they said, well, what's your platform? Had no idea what a platform was. So once we talked about a debate, I said, well, my idea is to have a kegger. Well, nothing sells better than a kegger to a bunch of dorm kids. So darned if I didn't get elected. So I became the first elected Latino in the University of Washington's student body organization. And I went to places like Denver, where they had the first Latino student convention, and I was a representative at that. I went to those kind of events. You get involved with a lot of community events where they ask people to go and speak. So you talk to a number of students. You get the chance to talk to parents about allowing their children to go to school, which was not an opportunity that was recognized in our community because we were always told no. And that was the same thing that happened with me. So you get used to doing that. I became a student recruiter for the University of Washington and helped recruit other kids to go to school. And that worked out really well. Later on, I got involved in more community organizations and events. And at one point, once I was hired and working for a state government, we were trying to create an organization in Pasco to help local community groups get involved. So I helped form that one. And they called it CPS, Chicanos in Public Service. And okay, so we helped that one get started and be a part of that. And I moved on to Olympia. And I left state government for 1 year and bought a business and was doing that and did well for a year. And everything turned around and we had some interesting changes, and I sold the business and came back into state service, got a promotion and a pay grade raise, and continued on doing those kind of things. And I ended up working in the prisons for 1 year. And I am not the biggest guy in the world, so I'm not the right guy to be working in prisons, but they had me doing presentations with prisoners. And I got to work with prison groups. I worked with the American GI Forum, which is a veterans group and I'm not a veteran, and I've never been in the service. I was drafted, and I weighed 103 pounds when I was drafted, and the military wouldn't take me. And I can understand that. They kept saying the Vietnam War was going on, and they said, well, I could be a tunnel rat. And they laughed. They said, no, the VC are bigger than you. So I couldn't join. So they told me, go back to school, get a job, pay your taxes, which is what I ended up doing. Anyway, so I was a member of the American GI Forum, and I did well for that for a number of years and helped them to grow their organization in Washington State. And got to meet a really interesting guy named Roy Benavides, who was a Medal of Honor winner. And he was selected by President Reagan at the time. And he came to Mount Vernon, and I got a chance to meet and work with him for a little bit. And what a great guy. He's since passed away, but he was a great guy. So I worked with that group for a while. And then there was a group here in the North Central Washington area. One of the things I was given an opportunity to do was to write a grant to do special programs for dislocated food processing workers. Now, the majority of those workers are women, and the majority of those women are Latinos. So I got a $3 million national grant for Washington State, and it was set through Employment Security, and I ran that program. And we helped people here in the North Central Washington area, Walla Walla and the Yakima Valley area when plant closures took place, helping them to get relined up, retrained, go to school, and apply for new jobs and see if they could get hired. That worked really well for a while, and I was really grateful to have that opportunity. That's when I got to meet some people in Stemilt and a number of those folks here in the area. That worked out really well. So that was another one of those times.
I know another area that I've witnessed your participation in and leadership is the immigration, naturalization, citizenship arena. And I just wanted you to say a few words about what you've done with that group and some of the folks that you've worked with that are leaders in that group.
There's two ways that I could look at that kind of piece. One of them is my role in state government. And for a while I worked in unemployment insurance, and there was a particular law in unemployment insurance that disallowed persons who were of alien nature to draw unemployment. And for a while I managed that program. So that got me involved with a lot of things. And I learned a lot about immigration law through some of the attorneys that were working specifically on immigration. That got me introduced to that process and how it worked. When I came to Wenatchee, I had a chance to meet with a lady named Norma Gallegos. And Norma was very active in citizenship program training here in the area. And she had large classes, and they were set up by the fairly close to the Wenatchee, the Wenatchee World newspaper. And so they would set these programs up, and they would have class sessions. And oddly enough, they asked me to come in and talk to this group. And I was identified to them as kind of a historian. So I talked a little bit about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Mexican War. And I talked a little bit about how Latinos are looked at in our country and some of the history we have in our country. So I did this for a bit of time. And oddly enough, they asked me to be a keynote speaker at one of the graduation ceremonies. So one of the graduation ceremonies was in East Wenatchee at Eastmont Junior High School. And a number of the local dignitaries, the mayors of Wenatchee and East Wenatchee, and I think the sheriff and some of those other elected officials were there. We were all standing around together, and they didn't know who I was at the time. So they were all talking about that odd moment of, what do you say to these new American citizens that were now becoming sworn in as U.S. citizens? And they all kind of stepped back and said, thank goodness we're not doing the the keynote speech because they didn't know what to say. And I was standing there all next to these guys and smiling because I was the person to give that speech. And they didn't know I was that person until I was asked to get on stage. And then everybody went, oh my goodness. So it was kind of interesting. And I talked about not only the Constitution, but the Bill of Rights and the other amendments to the Constitution. We now have 27 of them. And we talked a little bit about some of what those were and the responsibilities and rights that as U.S. citizens have. Like today, we talk about voting and how important that is, and the freedom of speech, the freedom to assemble, to carry a weapon, to, let me see, I mean, you can go down this list of all these rights and responsibilities we have. And being a new citizen, you have the right to do that. What was really interesting in that moment is I wanted them to know that they have the right to vote. And when they had the right to vote, they could vote for the mayor, they could vote for the sheriff, they could vote for some of those positions. And since we had those officials in the room, I was trying to let folks know that those elected officials work for these citizens and they're now their boss. And you could just see the cringe and the look on some of these elected officials going, let's not talk about that too much. And I was going, people need to understand their role. It was a great opportunity to just address things. And I think as citizens, we need to, at times, be reminded that that's an important piece. I guess if I could witness anything or explain anything, my parents, my father was in the service, World War II, was a veteran, was in the Air Force, and was in the South Pacific. Went through all of those kind of things and survived the war, came back, married my mother, and eventually wanted to move to Washington State because they couldn't find employment where they were at. And employment is a major portion of a lot of people's dignity, and it especially is for Latinos. So my folks were trying to come to Washington State because of that. When they came to Washington, and my folks got a job, and one of the things that my parents looked forward to doing is to say that they wanted their children to have a better life than what they had. So they were looking forward to my brothers and sisters and I, the three of us, to have a better future, and never thinking that college was even an opportunity. And that turned out to be, in my case, one of those end results. When I look at it today as a 70-year-old man, and I think of my children, and I have a son and a daughter. My daughter is just graduating now from college with honors, and she's wanting to go right into a master's program. My son already has graduated from college and has his master's already, and he's talking about going back for his PhD. And you look at that and you say, wow, what happened in just one generation of time and how much things have changed gets to tell us about a lot of how America is today. When I was growing up, as a matter of fact, when I first came to Wenatchee, I couldn't eat in some restaurants, believe it or not, and that was in 2003. Later on, when my daughter had moved to Spokane, after her husband had passed away from war injuries in Iraq, I went to visit her and bring her some furniture, and she took me out to dinner or lunch, and they wouldn't serve us at a restaurant in Spokane. I think that was about 2009, and you look at that and you're like, wow. I remember in the 1980s when I was on an assignment for the governor's office to look at public land in Grandview, just down the road from here, and I couldn't eat at a restaurant in Ellensburg. And when you get these moments that are really a slap in the face, when you're told you can't eat in a place where everybody else eats at. And I met with a lady one day, and she was telling me that her son couldn't get a haircut at one place and how insulting that was. And I'll be racial here for a moment. This lady was a white lady. She says, "I understand." And I said, "Well, I'm not sure if getting your hair cut or not getting your hair cut at a barber shop is indicative of the same kind of thing when it means the personal matter of you can't eat in a restaurant." I seen that when I was growing up. I witnessed that as an adult here in Wenatchee. And you look at it and you say, I'm hoping that life has changed enough so that my daughter can have a different life, an improved life, and my son can be in that same moment. We'll go through the same hard knocks of everybody else, getting laid off, getting reemployed, retiring and becoming a senior and talking to your neighbors and doing all that kind of stuff. And I had a couple of neighbors that lived next to us in a home that we have just 2 or 3 blocks from here. And one neighbor was highly insulted because Mexicans lived next to him. And I just kind of grinned through that and I said, well, I'm not going to change my race just to suit him, and I wasn't going to sell my house. So we just kind of worked our way through those kind of problems. Change is a hard piece for America, and we're fighting those battles even today. But it's important to see that not only was there a change from my parents' time to my time, I see a change for my children who are now adults, and I'm hoping to see better times for their children and grandchildren, and how people can find a way to live together. Yeah, get along.
Well, at this point in time, Tomas, we're enduring this pandemic, and we're in the central part of Washington State, obviously, which has had some difficulty with the numbers are quite high in terms of the numbers of folks being infected and hospitalized, so on and so forth, and I know that the Latino community has been strongly, affected in so many ways, and some of it is the work environments that they're in, I believe. And maybe you could, from your perspective, just say a few words about your thoughts on that topic.
Sure. Well, the biggest word that comes to mind is the yes/no kind of question. Can you get health care? When I worked in state government, sure, I had health care. I had a number of major things that affected me, and when my kids were growing up, they needed braces back in the day. They needed dental work done and so forth like that. That was covered because my insurance was there. But you look at our north central Washington portion, you look at our different populations here, our Latino population, and you say, can they get medical coverage? A lot of the private industry kind of operations really didn't have those kind of benefits available through their employment. More recently, one of our companies here, Stamil, now has its own kind of medical program and services, and so they're beginning to address that. What affects the average American on things like the dollar amount that they're getting, the benefit programs, retirement systems, and so forth. When we talk about that and you look at the general community, and if you put it in racial terms, you say, is that okay for white folks? Well, sure. Is it okay for black folks? Well, sure. And is it the same thing that Latinos would want? Well, of course. And somebody asked me years ago, they said, well, what do you guys really want? And I said, everything that you have, the same things that you're getting. Or if you're not getting them, why not? And we should all be getting things like this. So medical coverage is a key point. In the north central Washington portion, we're having a number of people become infected with the virus. And part of it becomes a question of Latinos becoming more affected than our Anglo population. So when you ask, why is that so? And part of it may be because of the work environment. And people are working closer together and they're all kind of interrelated. And part of that affects them. They're not wearing masks, and the work doesn't allow some of those possibilities, and that's why they, in part, become more affected. The other part is, from a public standpoint, how do we address that community? How do we talk to those folks? I remember a number of years ago, we had a fire in town, and it affected the whole area, and there was natural to say, let everyone know how the fire is going and how to stay indoors and be cautious of the smoke and so forth. And oddly enough, they never spoke to the Latino community, which is through the Spanish language programs. There are radio stations and so forth, and the word wasn't getting out. So Latinos were just oblivious to all it. So they never got addressed in any of this. And that came up back in 2008 or whenever those fires took place. Well, here we are today, and people are saying, how do you address things now? You have to talk to this population in the language and the customs that they need to understand, so they're more convinced what is right and what they need to do. Wearing a mask, is that important? Social distancing, is that important? We have a number of small children in school. A large number of these are Latinos. And how do you address them in school? And what do you teach them? And how do you deal with their parents? So a lot of these become really, really essential. The problems that we're learning is how to adjust as a community. It's not immoral, illegal to be a Latino. It is not immoral or legal to speak Spanish or to have your Latino customs and culture. That's not wrong. That's not un-American. That is as American as apple pie, or tortillas or burritos or anything else. But I guess what we need to do is learn to work with each other. And that's one of the issues that we're facing. So our community here is growing through that process. A ton of years ago, I was asked to sit on the city council, and I got interviewed by the Wenatchee World. And they thought it was a great idea until I found out I was living in the wrong spot, so I couldn't be a city council member, so I stepped down. And I said, that's okay, I'm not the only person here. And now we have, I think, 1 or 2 Latinos on the city council. And that's great, because the community is growing to that new piece. And so from a medical standpoint, I don't know enough about the virus to talk medically about things. Just knowing that you have the accessibility to be able to address this stuff is really good. To have the medical professionals be able to talk to folks in English or in Spanish and reach out to those. I have a mother that lives with us who's 95. And it's really interesting to see how they deal with geriatric care for seniors. And they're trying to deal with my mother, and they're asking the question, does she speak English? And I said, yeah, really well. And so how do you address that? One time we were stopped because my mother is really small. She's only 4'1". And we were stopped by the police because they thought I had a child in the front seat. And so I was being scolded by a police officer, and I smiled and said, John, I said, I can't convince this person to sit in the back in a child seat. And so this officer said, well, let me talk to him. I said, well, let me get him out of the car and you can talk to him. So my mother slid out of the seat, the front seat of this four-wheel drive pickup, and got outside, and she walked around and looked at this officer, and he didn't know what to say, so he goes, oh, crap. Got in his car and just drove off. And my mom looked at me and she said, what's going on? I said, oh, I think he was just confused. And so we let that go. I mentioned that to the police chief in Wenatchee, and he just kind of grinned through it. And I said, you know, it's when you have confusing moments, when you have things that are just what you think are normal and you find out they're not, because people come in different sizes, they come with different understandings like English and Spanish. You have to just learn to work through that, and people just struggle through that sometimes. I'm glad we're improving that here.
Yeah. Tomas, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been really enlightening, I think, for not only me, but our audience listening today. You've got an interesting perspective on things for a lot of reasons. And once we get reopened again, I want you to come down here and I'll buy you a free cup of coffee, okay? No cream or sugar, just black, but you know, that's how that's how we operate here.
That's how you roll.
Okay.
I'll be more than happy
All
to
right.
accept.
Thank
And
you,
I appreciate
Tomas.
it. Thank you.
Thank you.